decided to spend a year in Paris in order to improve her language skills. Little did she know that she would consequently spend most of her adult life in Paris, where she studied history and sociology, raised a family, and worked at the Sorbonne as an English teacher. When family circumstances obliged her to return to Detroit 7 years ago, Sarah decided to continue her study of French literature and culture. In 2007, she began studying at Wayne State and working as a graduate teaching assistant. Sarah received her master's degree in 2010 and enrolled in the PhD program in 2011. She has taught the 3 levels of basic French for us, as well as an introductory literature survey course, and has presented her research at several professional conferences. She continues to play an active role in the Graduate Forum, helping organize various events, as well as the annual Graduate Student Conference. Sarah is currently writing her dissertation, tentatively entitled Life on the Margins, Representations of Exclusion in Contemporary French Literature. Her dissertation examines 4 novels: La Place, The Place by Annie Ernaux, Moderato Cantabile by Marguerite Duras, Les Choses, Things by Perec, and Trois Femmes Puissantes, 3 Strong Women by Marine Diaye. Each novel portrays specific forms of exclusion, including the distinction introduced by social class, various contrasts posed by fluctuations in economic status and education levels, as well as ethnic differences. Sarah is writing her dissertation with the help of her doctoral committee, Professor Michael Giordano, Professor Ann Duggan, Professor Robert Hawley, and myself. Today's presentation is inspired by the analysis of Perec's novel Things, which portrays the beginnings of consumer society in the 1960s in France. Perec focuses on a young couple whose main source of happiness is derived from purchasing or wanting to purchase high-end consumer goods. We can view the characters' exclusion as economic. Although they do not suffer from poverty, their modest salaries do not allow them to realize their goal of extreme consumer spending. Perec adeptly emphasizes the essential role of advertising in creating false needs and inciting consumers to purchase more than they can afford. Please help me welcome Sarah Coulson today.
Thank you very much. I'm Sarah Coulson. Thank you all for coming, and I don't need to introduce my topic because my dissertation advisor has so kindly done it for me, and I would also like to thank all my committee members who have been very helpful with their editing and very generous with their time. Before beginning the subject of Things itself, I would like to talk for a minute about the notion of exclusion, and this term can be used to indicate a variety of situations creating different degrees of social discomfort. One definition of to exclude is to restrict the entrance of. We could use the example of a first-year university student excluded from the sorority of her choice, or a nouveau riche industrial excluded from a prestigious country club. Another definition of to exclude is to expel or bar, especially from a place previously occupied. Examples of this type of exclusion, we could cite the banishment of lepers in the High Middle Ages, or nearer to us, the systematic segregation of non-whites or certain immigrants forbidden to enter public places in the not-so-distant history of the United States. Although there exists a great difference in these types of exclusion, in each individual example, exclusion engenders some manner of suffering, unhappiness caused by the feeling of rejection, frustration due to one's inability to achieve one's personal goals, or anger because of an arbitrary differentiation imposed by society. Although the exclusion we will address today in our presentation of Things is not an exclusion in the strongest sense of the term, it nevertheless represents a lesser form of exclusion and an undeniable aspect of contemporary society. Okay, now I start the real thing. The subtitle of Perec's novel, Things, is A History of the 1960s, and that indicates the author's intent to analyze this era from a sociological perspective. Things is not a harsh criticism of consumer society, but rather an ironic portrayal of the social changes witnessed by the narrator. However, the reader may notice that the narrator's irony serves to dissimulate a lack of optimism regarding the transformations that are changing not only our relations with objects, but more importantly, our way of relating to one another. In France, the problems of the emerging consumer society were a noteworthy subject. At this time, the narrator of Things describes a society of abundance in which the forces of capitalism are still vigorous. There's a grand array of consumer goods on the market, as well as a highly developed network of advertising that attracts the consumer's attention to the excellent quality of the available products. Consequently, many consumers are tempted to purchase these seemingly irresistible items, even though they cannot afford them. The article, The Biological Object, written by Violet Morin in 1969, refers to sociological studies that, quote, have highlighted the network of diverse constraints imposed upon the consumer by overdeveloped societies. And the characters in Things affront such difficulties. These characters are Jerome and Sylvie, a young Parisian couple who, quote, were not rich, but wanted to be, simply because they were not poor. It is important that they are not poor. Therefore, they are not trapped in a constant struggle to live decently. They are free to dream of achieving happiness through the purchase of high-end consumer goods. Gachonard describes them as part of the, quote, urban lower middle classes, having neither tradition nor past, and whose only occupation is social climbing, notably by the acquisition of signs of wealth and well-being, which are things. The narrator always designates Jerome and Sylvie by the personal pronoun they, revealing in this way so few individual characteristics or distinctive psychological traits that the characters appear to represent a typical couple, even a stereotype of a young couple in this particular place and time. Jerome and Sylvie are experiencing enormous social transformations that are modifying human relations. Jean Baudrillard describes the unique situation of this generation. Quote, strictly speaking, the humans of the age of affluence are surrounded not so much by other human beings as they were in all previous ages, but by objects. Their daily dealings are now not so much with their fellow beings, but rather with the reception of goods and messages, end quote. Indeed, during their abundant free time, Jerome and Sylvie like nothing more than admiring the displays of luxury boutiques in the windows of luxury boutiques throughout Paris. Their fascination with the perfection of certain objects resembles religious devotion, yet this desire contains an element of fear. Quote, the immensity of their desires paralyze them. That's from Perec. They seem to have neglected an important aspect of these objects, as Baudrillard reminds us, quote, we have to describe these things as we see and experiencing them, never forgetting in their splendor and profusion that they are the product of human activity and are not dominated by ecological laws, but by the laws of exchange value. According to Stella Bayard, quote, this couple, particularly banal and casual in appearance, emerges as the prototype of an entire generation. Yet to what extent can we claim that an entire generation of a particular social class suffers from exclusion? Once again, we use the word exclusion in the sense of restricted entrance. And in order to answer this question, it is important to remember that Perec's text is not a novel that focuses on portraying the evolution of individual characters. Indeed, Things is a reflection on the social and even ideological problems of the era. The text exposes the malaise of average consumers who are heavily influenced by advertising, yet excluded from the dream of abundance by their limited financial resources. Leroy Day explains how the workings of capitalism influence these consumers in the society represented in Things. First, society must, quote, engender unrealistic expectations for wealth, leisure, and never-ending youth, so that when these are not fulfilled, the no longer quite so young will gladly accept the only route to even partial fulfillment, steady employment for an adequate, though not ample, wage, end quote. The mention of partial fulfillment leads to one of the buzzwords of the 1960s, which is alienation, meaning the subjugation of human beings to outside forces, the feeling of being dispossessed of oneself, and this can possibly lead to a break with reality and even to insanity. Jerome and Sylvie and their group of friends, quote, a representative sample of a new generation, that's from Behab, are alienated because they begin to recognize a disconnect between the message conveyed through the media and the likelihood of achieving the implicit promises of the advertiser's discourse such as wealth, leisure, and never-ending youth. And if we can take the liberty of updating the 1960s term, we see that the feeling of alienation could be interpreted as a form of exclusion. Jerome and Sylvie are excluded from the society of abundance from an economic perspective and from a social perspective. They also contribute to their own exclusion because of their bad personal choices. From an economic perspective, we must insist on the importance of the role of advertising in consumer society. Baudrillard explains that the recent interest and preoccupation with consumption, quote, does not mean that our society is not firstly, objectively, and decisively a society of production, an order of production, and therefore the site of an economic and political strategy. But it means that there is entangled with that order an order of consumption, which is an order of the manipulation of signs. It is the role of advertising to manipulate signs and to orient the consumer towards certain items that are desirable only because they are presented as symbols of prestige. Jerome and Sylvie belong to this world of advertising. They work in the newly created field of market research. They begin this career at an entry-level position, conducting brief and spontaneous interviews in public parks where they approach unsuspecting women and ask them if they have seen a certain advertisement and what they think of it. Jerome and Sylvie soon advance to the superior position of content analysis, which consists of longer interviews during which chosen consumers are asked a variety of different questions about their own personal habits of consumption. Quote, where do you go on vacation? Do you like frozen dinners? What do you think of your washing machine? Could you describe a man who likes pasta? And that's from Things. It's interesting to note that George Perec was once employed himself to conduct similar market surveys. so the profession is well known to him. Through their close contact with advertising, Jerome and Sylvie have developed an extreme fondness for luxury goods they cannot afford. As the narrator of Things says, in the world they inhabited, quote, in the world they inhabited, it was almost a rule of the game to desire more than one could acquire. This was not a decree of their own making, it was a law of society, end quote. The manipulative discourse of advertising has penetrated Jerome and Sylvie to the extent that they can find no purpose in life other than the accumulation of significant objects. Like many consumers of the 1960s, they are perplexed not only by the display of so much abundance, but also by the plethora of images of abundance, created and modeled by advertising and circulated through the media to the point of becoming an everyday occurrence in the consumer's life. Frustration ensues when the consumer realizes that abundance is both tantalizingly familiar and slightly out of their reach. Herbert Marcuse illustrates this point in his description of a highly industrialized society capable of containing social change through the use of new and more acceptable means of social control. In the society represented in Things, for example, the means of production hold sway over the population because they determine, quote, not only the socially needed occupations, skills, and attitudes, but also individual needs and aspiration. And that was Marcuse. This could explain why Jerome and Sylvie are only attracted to consumer goods representing wealth and luxury. These are the goods selected by advertisers as the necessary accoutrements for a stylish life. Many sociologists would consider, as Marcuse does, that the consumer profile of Perec's characters illustrates the concept of false needs, quote, superimposed upon the individual by particular social interest in his repression. In Perec's text, the repression incurred is not extreme. It takes the form of inciting Jerome and Sylvie to abandon the freewheeling lifestyle of their youth and devote themselves to working long hours in a profession they do not find personally satisfying. They work only in the hope of making enough money to purchase the merchandise they so ardently desire. It is almost amusing to note the extent to which Jerome and Sylvie believe that their desire for certain consumer goods is an expression of their unique personalities. They would be shocked to learn that these desires are in fact predetermined by the advertiser's well-organized discourse. It appears sometimes to the reader that Jerome and Sylvie have been deprived of a certain measure of freedom of thought. Their ability to choose and evaluate different consumer goods in an independent manner has been compromised by the indoctrination of advertising which has saturated the media. It is relevant to mention that the idea of false needs created by advertising, although contested by some, is fairly common in intellectual circles. Maurice Segura states that, quote, the idea that society creates artificial needs for individual consumers, which is an idea of Marxist origin, has become highly acceptable among writers, end quote. We see that advertising has become an important factor in the formation of the character's imagination. And this is a relatively new phenomenon, for in past centuries, literature played the role of suggesting idealized reality. Speaking to this point, certain critics have noticed the parallel between Things and Flaubert's 19th century novel, Madame Bovary. Although these two novels have very little in common, the comparison underscores the influence of a fictional discourse that encourages the characters to attempt an escape from reality. Emma Bovary was inspired by romantic novels, whereas Jerome and Sylvie turned to the mirage of advertisements. Another explanation of the power of advertising is the pervasive nature of its integration and distribution throughout the media. This creates an equality of a sort, for the same advertising is available to all consumers. However, access to advertising does not promote true equality and only reinforces our common identity as consumers. As Marcuse says, quote, if mass communications blend together harmoniously and often unnoticeably art, politics, religion, and philosophy with commercials, they bring these realms of culture to their common denomination, the commodity form. The delusion of consumer society is the implication that abundance is available to one and all. Despite their mediocre careers and their lack of ambition, Jerome and Sylvie do not doubt for a moment that a life of luxury awaits them. Baudrillard expresses this idea with the following question: does not the mass of consumers experience plenty as an effect of nature, persuaded by the advertiser's litany that all will be given to them and that they have a legitimate, inalienable right to plenty, end quote. However, this is yet another element of trickery embodied in the myth of consumer society. As Marcuse explains, quote, if a worker and his boss enjoy the same television program, this assimilation indicates not the disappearance of classes, but the extent to which the needs and satisfactions that serve the preservation of the establishment are shared by the underlying population. Baudrillard maintains that the term affluent society is in itself a misnomer, for, quote, we are not in an era of real affluence. Every present day individual, group, or society, and even the species as such, stand under the sign of scarcity, end quote. The logic of the consumer society is based on the creation of a growth society, as if by producing more and more, there will ultimately be enough for everyone. Growth societies are generally democracies whose constitutions proclaim equality for all. And although extreme poverty has improved during certain periods of growth, inequality remains and even increases in relative terms. For Baudrillard, growth produces neither equality nor inequality. Quote, it is growth itself which is a function of inequality. It is the need of the egalitarian social order, the social structure of privilege, to maintain itself that produces and reproduces growth as its strategic element. Hence, growth society does not create inequality, but reproduces the existing inequalities in society. These inequalities are not primarily based on disparity of income, for although income is indeed an important factor in determining access to consumer goods, it can and has been regulated to some extent, and more so in France than in the United States. The major inequality found in growth society, in distinct contradiction to the democratic and egalitarian principles the society claims to defend, lies in the social structures defining the relation between its members. Growth society, or consumer society, reinforces the production of differentiation, social discrimination, and the existence of an elite, a small group of individuals who not only dispose of economic advantages, but also monopolize resources of knowledge, power, and culture. The elite consumer whose discernment allows her to step away from the dictates of advertising and choose her purchases with originality and imagination, and also with the aim of signifying her social distinction. This particular consumer good, the one that is chosen by the elite, will not be mass-produced until the elite consumer has tired of it and innovates a replacement, which the replacement itself is not yet a mass-market item. Hence, the distance between the elite consumer and the mass-market consumer is maintained. If Jerome and Sylvie lust after specific high-end consumer goods, it is not for the use value of these items, but rather for their symbolic value. Actually, Jerome and Sylvie are unsure of their personal taste. They crave only the products anointed by the advertiser's discourse. As Perec explains in an interview with Pierre de Groppe in 1965, the discourse that accompanies the product is more important than the product itself. The example Perec suggests is poutre apparent, exposed beams. It is the words that are important because of what they signify. In this case, they evoke a room that is rustic and authentic. In fact, the words poutre apparent bear more weight, excuse the pun, than the actual beams themselves. Referring to the representation of consumer society in things, Pierre Bourdieu describes advertisers as, quote, mystified mystifiers who are both creators of the discourse on things and fascinated by things whose only value resides in the discourse that defines them, end quote. In other words, the objects that Jerome and Sylvie desire incarnate a symbolic value because, and here we approach the perspective of social position, Jerome and Sylvie have not been acculturated to appreciate the use value of these desperately coveted things, and their desire remains abstract. As the narrator of things says, quote, tradition, perhaps in the most despicable sense of the term, was unknown to them. True and obvious enjoyment, implicit and imminent, accompanied by physical gratification, whereas their pleasure was cerebral. Although perhaps Jerome and Sylvie are not entirely conscious of this telling observation of the narrator, they are aware of their social class. While window shopping, quote, they stared desperately at the obvious comfort, the luxury, the perfection of the grande bourgeoisie. They are intent on acquiring things for their symbolic value. The tenacity of their will to consume is an attempt to forge an identity and a desire to be different than they are. They try to acquire objects whose symbolic value will give them the appearance of grand bourgeois, or middle class, higher middle class. However, they realize that they lack certain innate attributes of the class they are trying to integrate. They recognize that acquiring certain consumer goods may not be sufficient to gain access to a higher social position. They know that they are insecure and uptight, ill at ease with themselves. As the narrator describes the class deficiencies, quote, they lacked affluence. This was undoubtedly the most serious. Not only material affluence, but a way of being casual, of being relaxed, end quote. It is not enough for Jerome and Sylvie to conquer the world and acquire the objects of their desire. Both the world and the things would have to have been theirs from the beginning of time. We see that the social structures reproduced by consumer society make it very difficult, if not impossible, for Jerome and Sylvie to be accepted as part of the grande bourgeoisie. Bourdieu analyzes in depth the lower middle class, which is the social origin of Jerome and Sylvie and their group of friends. a certain category of this very diverse social class is occupied in newly invented professions developed in response to the recent transformations of the economy and concerning the creation of consumer needs. These professions include marketing, public relations, advertising, and design, among others, and they're professions that deal with changes in lifestyle. These jobs are often occupied by employees without a lot of formal education, and hence reuniting people of different social backgrounds. Some of these employees originate from the upper middle class in decline, and others, like Jerome and Sylvie, are from the lower middle class in upward mobility. What the two groups of employees in the new fields have in common are insufficient academic credentials and an attraction to risk and new ideas. And Jerome and Sylvie, for example, drop out of higher education because they are seduced by the myth of consumer society and the market survey jobs they find when they leave the university. Their university courses pay relatively well. According to Bourdieu, the mission of the employees in these new fields is, quote, to invent a new way of living, especially concerning domestic life, and to redefine their social coordinates, end quote. Bourdieu calls the employees in these new fields cultural intermediaries because the lower middle class employees collaborate with their middle class colleagues in order to persuade consumers of all classes to adopt the recently invented products and hence validate the change of lifestyle that these products are supposed to represent. The lower middle class cultural intermediaries, such as Jerome and Sylvie, embrace their role of avant-garde consumers, specialized in domestic savoir-faire and its necessary lifestyle changes because they are motivated by the possibility of upward social mobility. And more concretely, as demonstrated by Jerome and Sylvie, they would like their own lifestyle to resemble the model illustrated in advertisements. The elaboration of this model itself, that is the model of the lifestyle changes, is created at a higher level of class, and we could say that the model is created by the ruling classes. And according to, however, in concerning social upward mobility, according to Bourdieu's analysis, being employed in these new fields and acting as a cultural intermediary does not facilitate upward mobility for the lower middle classes. On the contrary, such a position would be more likely to create a confusion of identity among the lower middle class employees who work in this environment. Quote, and this is Bourdieu, the new cultural intermediaries are placed in an awkward position in the social structure because in the hierarchy of production they have little economic capital, social capital, or cultural capital, and they are encouraged to identify with a discourse that aims to question the cultural order that the hierarchy aims to maintain. In other words, Jerome and Sylvie are in a hopelessly ambiguous situation. In order to do their job convincingly, they must believe in the advertising propaganda they are endorsing. They must also believe in the possibility of their own upward mobility. Yet in his analysis of growth society, Bourdieu demonstrates that social inequalities are reproduced in order to maintain the differentiation and distinction that continue to signify the superiority of those who occupy a privileged position because of their social, economic, and cultural capital. Are Jerome and Sylvie aware of this? Well, the reader never knows the depth of what they're thinking. Perhaps they are aware of the ambiguity of their profession and simply choose to turn a blind eye on what Bourdieu calls, quote, the principle of dissimulation and ignorance, end quote, that is necessary in their work. Or perhaps, as Perec suggests, they are incapable of analyzing their place in society because, quote, their understanding of the world is linked to their social situation in the system of production. Actually, both of these scenarios could coexist in the world of things. Jerome and Sylvie could have chosen to ignore the pesky intimations of doubt in order to pursue their dream, like children who, growing up and can't stop believing in Santa Claus. However, Bourdieu's analysis seems closer to Jerome and Sylvie's socioeconomic reality. When Bourdieu refers to the hierarchy in the quotation cited above, he is designating those who own and control the means of production. It is in their interest to maintain the existing cultural order, although their business model is based on questioning and even changing this order. The discourse of advertisers has demonstrated and still demonstrates a remarkable ability to create consumer desires in order to incite spending. The role of cultural intermediaries working in professions created by recent transformation of the economy consists in endorsing these new consumer needs and persuading mass consumers of the importance of these lifestyle changes represented by the new products. Lower middle class employees such as Jerome and Sylvie find themselves living in, quote, the antinomy between the subversive dispositions symbolically linked to the position in the division of labor and the functions of manipulation or of conservation attached to the position. And that is, of course, Pierre Bourdieu. In a nutshell, they work in an advertising domain whose aim is to propagate a false ideology. Affluence is not within the reach of everyone. Upward social mobility is extremely difficult to achieve since the existing social inequalities are reproduced and even increased in relative terms by the mechanism of consumer society. Perec's novel depicts the deception and the disillusion of many consumers on the lower rungs of the social ladder whose faith in the implicit promise of consumer society has not only failed to deliver its rewards, but also left the consumers immersed in debts. Their naive belief in their inevitable social mobility left them to experience an economic status that was even more perilous than before the myth of abundance had seduced them. So quickly, although economic and social structures prevent Jerome and Sylvie from achieving their dream of social mobility, the analysis would not be complete without examining the characters from an individual perspective. This analysis will allow us to step away from the arid concepts elaborated by the disciplines of economics and sociology and turn our attention to the personal habits of the characters, hence satisfying the spark of curiosity we feel despite our usual self-imposed high-mindedness when we are awarded a glimpse into the intimacy of the lives of others. Basically, Jerome and Sylvie refuse to participate seriously in the working world. They travel frequently for their market research interviews, earn a decent amount of money, and then spend it all prodigiously while waiting for their employers to propose another assignment. In the interview with de Groot cited above, Perec explains, in a delightful project which I was unable to translate sufficiently, he explains the dilemma of the work-liberty opposition. To paraphrase, although it may seem idyllic to own a beautiful apartment and its equally attractive furnishings, in order to do so would require one to spend a great deal of time working and undertaking responsibilities. Jerome and Sylvie believed that the simple fact of possessing the right objects would eliminate all their problems. In such an apartment, says the narrator of Things, quote, life would be easy, simple. All the obligations and problems that accompany material life would find a natural solution. While Jerome and Sylvie realize that the lifestyle of their dreams requires a lot of money, they do nothing to advance in their profession. They want a life with no constraints, a life of travel and parties with their friends. The group of friends is essential for the happiness of Jerome and Sylvie. It allows them to have a social life without a trace of intimacy between the couple, or between the two of them. The friends in the group share the same social background and the same projects for the future. The existence of the group is a crafty narrative technique. It indicates that the dream of happiness inculcated by consumer society is widespread, especially among a certain generation. Jerome and Sylvie are not the only consumers influenced by advertising. Their friends also believe they will find happiness by acquiring the right merchandise. According to Stella Béat, quote, their entire generation is characterized by brutal indifference and absolute isolation of each individual to another. Hence, their desire for one another is diverted. They find satisfaction only in the passion of consumption, end quote. In Perec's text, belonging to the group reinforces the desire to consume. When the friends meet, they usually eat and drink together, imagining the prosperity and luxury that awaits them in their future. During a night of heavy drinking, quote, they believed the whole world was made for them, unquote, end quote. But upon awakening the next day, quote, they felt empty and stupid. The friendship within this group is fragile and superficial, based only on advertising slogans and the necessity to consume. For that matter, the friends subsequently stop seeing each other and the group dissolves. In response to the work-liberty dilemma, Jerome and Sylvie choose liberty, although they know that, quote, their liberty was only an illusion. This choice does not help them in their quest for affluence and well-being. They begin to experience financial difficulties, but instead of returning to school to complete a university degree or accepting a stable position in their company, they dream of inheriting money or winning a lottery. Their daily life is sordid at times. They borrow money, eat disgusting fast food, and wait 5 or 6 weeks before changing their sheets. Their real life is in total contradiction with their imaginary life, yet they take no concrete action in view of reaching their ideal objective. Jerome and Sylvie are therefore excluded from the promise of abundance. Their exclusion is demonstrated from an economic perspective, for although consumer society strives to produce more and more in absolute value, in relative value, abundance is only produced for the elite. From a social perspective, consumer society reproduces inequality by maintaining social structures of differentiation and distinction. Jerome and Sylvie may acquire more consumer goods than previous generations of a similar social position, but they will not advance in the social hierarchy. Upward mobility is possible in consumer society, but Jerome and Sylvie are too passive and lacking in drive to overcome their exclusion from the collective dream of abundance for all. We note once again that theirs is a milder form of exclusion, more like isolation and disengagement. Bourdieu speaks of, quote, the existential mood of an entire generation, tired of hoping desperately for collective hope, turning to the withdrawal of narcissistic mysticism as a substitute for the hope of changing society or even understanding it, end quote. This type of exclusion light is all the more dangerous as it is insidious.
So we welcome any questions, and in fact, I'd like to open up the discussion with one. Sarah, you very nicely show how the two characters function. Perec builds them as a prototype, as a representation, representatives of a certain generation through various narrative techniques. And but you also showed that there is an attempt at trying to establish some sort of identity. But then that identity itself is a social class, is the grande bourgeoisie. And I'm wondering if you might have found in your research any clues in the text that might hint at the existence of the individual. You talk a little bit towards the end about the characters themselves, but are there any specific clues as to hint this distinction?
They are very rarely spoken of as individuals. At one point within the text, in order to escape from the desire to consume and from the desire to spend all their money, Jerome and Sylvie decide to travel to Tunisia and travel and work in Tunisia. And in this case, Sylvie finds a job because she has more education than Jerome, so they're separated in this sense because they have different activities, and they are seen slight in an individual light, but they are very closely identified to the group, and either as part of a group or as part of a couple.
I think it would be good to try to identify more, because in that way you could challenge both Béat and Bourdieu, who is rather dogmatic in his views, and it would allow for, I think, a more nuanced analysis of the novel.
They also, when Jerome and Sylvie they have cultural activities and things they like to do, and they like going to the cinema, and they like, as I said, going to restaurants. But often when they go to the cinema, they go to see a film that they've seen the advertisement for a certain film that is supposed to be wonderful, and often they're disappointed by it. So even in their personal tastes, they don't really achieve happiness. Yes?
It seems to me that throughout your discussion, you really seem to be describing a philosophy of materialism. I don't know what other rational explanations other than sheer materialism, I mean, the economic analysis and the social science research, but it seems to me that this is basically just people who are so materialistic that they're imbued with nothing else but that.
That is what I was saying, and I think my dissertation director said that is basically true, but I could also, it's not completely true, so that's a mistake that I should have included more examples that show that they are not only that, although that is a very big part of their identity.
Another mistake is a challenge.
A challenge, excuse me. Yes?
Just a footnote or two. First of all, you referenced the affluent society, and I think it's worth recognizing that John Kenneth Galbraith intended that title ironically, but the mood of the 50s was to latch onto it in more of a self-congratulatory manner. So Galbraith had some real acerbic insights about the affluent society. But more importantly, I'm not sure whether Jerome and Sylvie are prototypes or stereotypes. Okay. Much of this has the feel to me of intellectuals looking down their nose at those who don't share their exquisite refinement and their academic credentials. Okay. And kind of the one thing you said that kind of really pointed this, the reader never knows the depth of their thinking. Okay. In other words, we have these cartoon cutouts, and forgive me, the novelist hasn't done his job because he really did not give them dignity. And as a card-carrying member of the lower middle class, I will assure you there are ways to find dignity there, but one has to look, and one cannot find it by looking down the nose.
I would say that the narrator is ironic. I think he's being humorous, and the reader has a right to react as he sees fit, but I didn't see it so much as not giving him dignity as it was kind of a gentle mocking. But that is a very good point, that there's somebody looking down their nose who is, and I didn't have time to go into it today, who is the narrator. Because the narrator is the one who makes a lot of comments that we're not really sure if Jerome and Sylvie know this or not. Are they aware of what the narrator is saying? Because we can't be sure. But I didn't really, I read it more as something amusing. And when I've also seen video clips YouTube clips of George Perec, and he himself he's an intellectual, obviously, but he speaks about this in a humorous way also.
But mockery is one thing among equals, but across class lines, it can really hurt.
A footnote, I don't think there is much difference about class lines, they're just one class portrayed. But I think Perec here uses these characters as puppets. You very nicely refer to them as cartoons. I think it's a specific narrative technique employed by Perec to specifically toy with an idea through these characters. Yeah, it's not fair to the characters themselves, but if they're just seen as puppets, then I think it makes it a little bit less cruel. But I think they're just used as, puppets to create an arena in which he can toy with a certain idea.
Well, what's one to say about Flaubert and his depiction of the Bovaries? I mean, I don't see
There's no
us
dignity.
wanting to go back and spank him. I mean, it's, to what extent is Perec, or any of the interviews, is he influenced by or aware of Barthes and mythologies? Do you know anything, any connection there?
I'm sure he is. I don't know anything that he's written about mythology. I guess I can ask the question to my dissertation director, but
Who is
I can't
the source of
imagine
all
that-
wisdom?
Who's confronted all of a sudden with the
Doesn't-
idea, but
he's-
I think that's a great connection, Charlie, thank you.
I mean, Perec doesn't write this novel in a vacuum. I mean, there is this discussion that's been going on, I mean, what is Les Choses 62 or 65?
65.
65. So there's been a discussion going on for a decade. And, not just, I mean, you cited a number of individuals, but the importance of mythologie is that from the early 50s onward, Barthes, I don't think he was alone, but nonetheless was in the forefront of commentators in the French press discussing these issues of mass consumption of all sorts and all sorts of levels. And Mythologie as a volume comes out in '57 with its addendum Myth Today, which was an attempt, however awkward, to systematize what he had been doing for many years in those short pieces that he was publishing in the more popular press. So I'm sure Perec, of course, was imbued by that kind of discussion, but then subsequently, within the next eight or 9 years, up to the point of the shows being published, you got the whole structuralist debate. and the various ways in which structuralism was being trotted out as a means of analysis of different sorts of objects. And so within the French context, there's been this whole discussion going on. In some ways, his way of portraying Sylvie Jérôme is sort of a narrativization of many of the things that have been going on and being discussed over the last decade or so.
So you think that reading this what Bart wrote about myths could be useful in understanding part of?
You know, you don't want to slap Barthes onto your reading. It's just I'm saying that there is this broader. There's Perec's not writing within a vacuum. I mean, and then there's the whole new novel side too. I mean, the new novel has unfolded at the same time as this sociocultural discussions that's been going on, and it's almost as if these are two debates that are not sort of don't meet, and that's one of the beautiful things about Perec in many ways, where they shows sort of brings playful, ludic techniques that one might associate with the new novel, but there's also Oulipo and that whole project. A number of intellectual strands seem to be at work and converging in les choses. And so the narrator, however cruelly might appear in terms of his modes of representation, is sort of, in many ways, he's channeling a whole lot of discussion that's has been going on for quite some time within France, and poor Jérôme and Sylvie sort of bear the brunt of a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, it is in many ways that this is an extension of his Oulipo practices to create such puppets and to have them play.
And then there's Système de la Mode of Barthes, where he talks about how these things, one of his examples of the way advertising naturalizes things is he quotes the sentence, "Les robes se font longues cette année." They're just making themselves.
Yeah,
What could I, far be it from me to understate the power of advertising. And I have to think of thousands of people lining up to get their newest iPhone or, their newest iPhone, and even fighting. So I would never understate that. But what fascinates me is that we talk about false needs in this, and I kept thinking this is sort of like the negation of the negation. This is not good. He's satirizing, parodying a false need. What does he say anything about what would be a true or authentic need? I heard you talk about getting a university degree, but that might be just reading into it. What would be an example? Does he give an example
Well,
of
he
what
gives an example of what Jérôme and Sylvie tried to do. And speaking of Oulipo, some people say that Jérôme would stand for gérer un homme, and Sylvie would be style de vie. So, but they're tired. They want to leave the materialism behind, and they go to Tunisia, and they want to have a life that is pure and simple, and where they can get a fresh start and see things as be more connected to nature. And this attempt is a huge failure because they're so invested in French cultural references that they're unable to do so. So I think the question was, is there any mention of another way of
a true
approaching
need
life,
or
a
authentic
true
need?
need? I think maybe Jérôme and Sylvie thought that their true need would be met by this living in Tunisia and changing their dependence on consumer society, but they were not able to do this.
I think the question of the true need is the undercurrent running through the entire novel, but from the reader's perspective. You read it and you constantly pose that question.
Isn't the trip to Tunisia more like this narcissistic mysticism as a substitute that you have in this final Bourdieu quote? I mean,
Yes, also, yes.
I mean, because it's almost as if they, although Perec doesn't go there, he would be a little bit too visionary to go to turn them into hippies. nonetheless, they announce the idea of the hippie utopianism, the communism of the later 60s, and Jerome and Sylvie are going off to the desert, as it were. But that was a fundamental blunder when there's nothing to consume.
Well, there are things to consume, but they don't, because they don't correspond to their French system of cultural
Right,
reference,
right.
their
There's
cultural
no advertising
code.
in Tunisia, so.
Right, that's right.
The position of the market research, the market survey, that job doesn't exist,
Right.
so.
Yeah, around these times, there are other people in, Michel de Certeau, for example, wanted to look at this as the way a flaneur would play with the objects that are trying to push you to buy. In other words, go out, walk around, use your imagination to mock them to yourself or to use them in different ways, and so on. So there certainly are ways of looking at this which would be more agent-oriented, willing, exercise my will against what things are pushing me. So.
I can see that from the narrator's point of view, but I don't see it in Jerome and Sylvie, but perhaps I could
There's something
try.
there.
Yeah.
I was hinting at that with the individual too, it's like the idea of agency.
Mhm.
I think there are some textual clues.